In January of 1888, a blizzard came down from Canada and killed people the way a door slams shut. Not slowly, not with warning. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 hours. The wind reached 70 miles an hour before the instruments at the Huron weather station broke and stopped recording. Snow drove sideways and erased the world. Children died walking home from school a quarter mile from their own front doors. Men died steps from their porches, turned around by whiteout walking in the wrong direction until they stopped walking altogether. Across Dakota Territory and into Nebraska and Minnesota, hundreds of people perished. The open-range cattle industry, which had been building since the end of the Civil War, was financially broken in a single afternoon. But there was a strip of land along the James River where none of that happened. Not one person dead, not one case of frostbite, not a single water pipe burst. Livestock survived. Children woke up warm. Families who had taken in neighbors from the road sat in kitchens that held steady while the world outside came apart. That story does not begin in January of 1888. It begins in the summer of 1886 on a morning when the temperature sat at 85 degrees and a 58-year-old woman named Margaret Nissen was on her knees in the mud behind her woodshed alone, digging a hole by hand. Her neighbor saw her and moved on. A woman digging a hole behind a woodshed. In the opinion of nearly everyone who passed that summer, there was nothing to understand and therefore nothing to ask about. They stacked their cordwood against the exterior walls of their houses the same way their fathers had done it and their fathers before them. And they told each other the old Norwegian woman was going soft in her old age. What none of them could have guessed was that the small space Margaret Nissen was opening in the earth that summer would become the most important structure within 20 miles. And by the time they understood what she had built, some of them would be sitting on her kitchen floor in the dark hands, pressed against warm boards, and they would not have words for what they were feeling. Margaret Nissen arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1873. She was 22 years old, and she came with her husband, Thomas, a man of quiet strength and careful habits from the Telemark region of Norway. They homesteaded 160 acres near the James River, broke sod through prairie grass that resisted the plow like twisted rope, and built their first shelter from the ground itself because there was no timber within 15 miles. Thomas died in the fall of 1881. A crossbeam in the barn gave way during harvest, and it came down across his shoulders, and he did not get up. Margaret was in the house when it happened. She heard the sound, but not what caused it, and by the time she reached the barn, it was already over. She did not cry in front of anyone. That evening, after the neighbors had come and mowed and the arrangements had been made, she drove the wagon out to the far edge of the east field and sat in the dark for 3 hours. The horse, a Norwegian fjord named Gull, who was already 8 years old and had the temperament of something much older, stood in the traces and waited without complaint. When Margaret finally drove back to the house, she unhitched Gull, fed him, and went inside. No one saw her face that night. Only Gull was there, and Gull said nothing. She ran the farm alone after that. She was not the only widow in the settlement, and she did not ask for treatment any different from what she gave herself, which was none. She fixed what broke, she planted what needed planting, she kept better stock than most of her neighbors, and wasted less wood than any of them, and she wrote to her son Daniel twice a month without fail. Daniel had been a boy of 9 years old in 1883 when a fever moved through the settlement and took 3 children in a single week. Margaret made a decision that cost her something she would never fully get back. She sent him to live with a cousin in Minnesota, a family with older children, in a warm house, and a father who came home every night. She wrote her reasoning in a letter to the cousin that ran 4 pages and said nothing about how it felt to put a child on a wagon headed east and watch until the wagon was gone. She wrote to Daniel twice a month. He wrote back less often as the years passed. Margaret's father was a man named Garrett Whitmore, a Pennsylvania stonemason who had spent his working life building foundations that other men stood on without knowing or caring why they held. He was a practical man without sentimentality, and he taught his daughter from the time she could carry a stone that the earth was not something to be afraid of. It was something to be understood. Garrett had learned the core of what he knew from an old German craftsman named Wilhelm Kessler, who had worked on the restoration of a colonial-era building in Philadelphia, and who had encountered embedded in its lower structure a system of heat channels that no one could immediately explain. Kessler spent 2 months figuring it out. What he found was a rudimentary version of the Roman hypocaust, the ancient engineering system that heated the floors of bathhouses by circulating hot air through hollow channels beneath stone. The Romans had understood something that most people in 1886 had forgotten entirely, that stone is not merely a building material. Stone is a memory for heat. It absorbs slowly and releases slowly, and if you give it enough mass and enough insulation, it will hold what you put into it for days. Kessler passed this understanding to Garrett in the way that useful knowledge traveled before it was written in books: by watching, by asking questions, by doing the work. Garrett built a version of it in the basement of his Pennsylvania farmhouse in 1849, a small chamber of flat granite cobbles beneath the kitchen floor, fired twice a week in deep winter, that kept the pipes from freezing and the floor from going cold even when the stove ran out in the night. Margaret was 9 years old the first time she stood in that chamber and pressed her palm against the granite wall and felt the heat moving outward through the stone. Her father said nothing theatrical about it. He said, "Stone doesn't know how to doubt. That is why it holds heat longer than people do." She was 58 years old in the summer of 1886, and she had never forgotten that wall. But here is the thing that none of her neighbors knew, because she had never told anyone, not even Thomas, when he was alive. The winter of 1877, Thomas had gone to Yankton for 3 days in January, and a storm came in while he was gone and stayed. The temperature dropped to 18 below, and the wind made the walls flex. Margaret burned through the wood pile faster than she planned, rationing toward the end, and on the second night, she ran out entirely. There was no way to reach the exterior stack, which was drifted over and frozen solid. She burned the floorboards of the back room to get through the third night. Not a wallboard, not furniture, the floor itself. She pulled them up with a crowbar and fed them into the stove one by one, and sat in the kitchen and waited for Thomas to come home. When he arrived on the fourth day and saw what she had done, he did not ask why. She did not explain. They looked at each other across the kitchen, and then Thomas went out to assess the damage, and Margaret started coffee, and neither of them spoke about it again. They rebuilt the floor in April, but Margaret had not forgotten what it felt like to sit in that kitchen and realize she was out of options. She was a woman who had learned to build from a father who built with stone, and she had been sitting in her own house burning the floor to survive, and there was no version of that she could make peace with. It was not the cold that had broken something in her that night. It was the helplessness, the knowledge that she had done everything right, and it still was not enough. She had been thinking about what to do instead for 9 years. In June of 1886, Daniel wrote that he might come visit in the spring. Not that he would, that he might. He was working in Minneapolis, something in a trading office, and the work was uncertain. Margaret read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then folded it and put it in the tin box under her bed with the rest of them. She went outside that afternoon and looked at the woodshed. The morning she started digging, Frank Alderman drove past on the road that ran along the north edge of her property. He was a neighbor, 47 years old, a large and generally good-natured man who had homesteaded his land 2 years before Margaret and Thomas arrived. He saw her kneeling in the mud behind the woodshed with a spade, and he pulled the horse to a stop. "Margaret," he called from the road, "what are you doing?" She did not look up. "Digging." "I can see that. Digging for what?" "To get through the winter." Frank looked around. The sky was clear and the temperature was 85 degrees, and there were 3 months of workable weather ahead of them. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has decided not to argue with something he does not understand, and he drove on. 3 days later, his wife Vera came to call. Vera Alderman was 44 years old, and she was the most practical woman in the settlement, which was not a small distinction in a place where impractical people did not last long. She sat down at Margaret's kitchen table without being invited, which was the custom between women who knew each other well enough, and she said what she had come to say without preamble. Margaret, you are digging a large hole under your woodshed. You live alone. There is no one to pull you out if the earth moves. And you are not as young as you were. Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her. She was quiet for a moment. Then Vera, how many cord of wood did you burn last winter? What does that have to do with anything? How many? Vera paused. 8, maybe 8.5. I burned 4.5, and I was warm. Margaret wrapped her hands around her cup. This will be the second time I have done something like this. The first time was under my father's house in Pennsylvania when I was 9 years old. I watched him build it, and I helped him fire it, and I felt what it did. I have been thinking about how to do it here for 9 years, and now I am going to do it. Vera looked at her for a long moment. There was something in Margaret's face that was not argument and not anger. It was simply settled the way stone is settled. What do you need from me? Vera asked. To let me do this without people coming by to ask me if I have lost my mind. Vera was quiet, then she picked up her coffee. I won't say anything. She kept that promise. She told no one, not even Frank, and she did not come back to the woodshed to watch. This was not agreement. Vera still thought Margaret was doing something that had better odds of going wrong than right. But she had recognized something in that kitchen that she could not argue with, and so she did not argue. What Margaret built that summer was not a root cellar, though it looked like one at first to anyone who happened to see the hole. The excavation she opened beneath the existing floor of her woodshed measured 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, roughly the volume of a small bedroom turned on its side. She dug it by hand over the course of 19 days, working in the mornings before the sun made the clay too hard and the labor too punishing. The soil in that part of the James River Valley ran dark near the surface and transitioned to a dense gray clay about 18 inches down. Clay was, for her purposes, almost ideal. It did not breathe easily. It did not allow moisture to creep in from the sides. It held its shape once it dried with a rigidity that people who had never worked with it tended to underestimate. She removed approximately 4 tons of material from that hole and wheeled it to the low ground behind the barn where it would not be noticed. She kept the woodshed standing above the excavation throughout the process using temporary props made from pine poles she had purchased from a mill in Huron, 23 miles northwest. 6 poles. The woodshed floor, already elevated on wooden sills, became the ceiling of the chamber below, and she reinforced it by nailing 2 additional layers of 1-inch pine planking across the joists, bringing the total ceiling thicknesses to just under 4 inches. On the 15th day of digging, as she was working in the lower section of the north end, she noticed a seam of clay that ran darker and wetter than what surrounded it. She stopped and pressed her fingers into it, wetter than it should have been at that depth. She crouched in the dim light from the hatch above and thought about it for 30 minutes, turning the problem the way her father had taught her to turn problems from every angle before deciding anything. Then she shifted the planned firebox location 6 inches to the south to avoid the seam entirely. Nobody told her to do this. Nobody knew she had done it. It was the kind of decision that gets made in silence and never gets recorded and matters enormously anyway. On the 11th day, one of the temporary props shifted. She was in the hatch when it happened, 6 feet below the woodshed floor, and she heard the wood creak above her in a way that her body understood before her mind did. She stood absolutely still and counted to 10. Then she reached up, pushed the prop back into position, with both hands found a flat stone on the floor of the excavation and wedged it under the base. Then she went back to digging. That evening, she ate supper alone and did not look toward the woodshed once. On the 15th day, Walter Pruitt drove past on the road to the south. He was 34 years old and had come to the settlement in 1884, 2 years before. He had a wife named Agnes who was expecting their 3rd child, 2 sections of good bottom land, and the confidence of a man whose strength had never yet been seriously tested. He saw the mound of excavated earth behind Margaret's barn, noticed the props visible through the woodshed's side gap, slowed his horse for a moment, and then kept moving. That evening, he said to Agnes, "The old woman over on the north road is doing something odd behind her barn." Agnes asked what. "Can't tell from the road. Probably nothing important." He was wrong about that. He would not understand how wrong for another year and a half, and by then the understanding would cost him something he could not get back. The walls of the chamber came next, and this was where the work became something closer to the craft Margaret had grown up watching. She spent 4 days driving the wagon along a dry creek bed 3 miles south of her property, selecting flat-faced granite cobbles by hand. She knew what she was looking for: density first, then at least two flat faces, then a minimum thickness of 3 inches. Granite was the priority above everything else. Sandstone fractures under rapid temperature change. Limestone holds moisture. Granite does neither. It absorbs heat slowly without cracking, and it releases that heat even more slowly, like a coal that never fully goes cold. Gull was 15 years old and not built for heavy hauling, but he made 11 trips over the course of a week and a half without complaint, which was more than could be said for most of the people in the settlement. By the time she was done, Margaret had accumulated roughly 4,200 pounds of granite cobble in and around the chamber. She stacked the wall stones dry without mortar, leaving quarter-inch gaps between them deliberately. Those gaps were not sloppiness. They were engineering. Hot air circulating through the mass during a firing could reach the interior stones, not just the surfaces, which meant the entire wall held heat, rather than just the face of it. The floor of the chamber she paved in the flattest stone she had collected, bedded into 2 inches of packed clay, mixed with fine creek sand in a ratio of 3 parts clay to 1 part sand. The surface was not smooth, but it was solid, and it would not shift. At the north end of the chamber, directly beneath a gap she had left in the woodshed's north wall, she built the firebox. It was a small, low structure, roughly 30 inches wide, 20 inches tall, and 18 inches deep, constructed from the densest granite she had, and sealed on the interior face with a thick plaster of clay and ash mixed to the consistency of very stiff bread dough. The firebox had a single opening at the front, sealed with a fitted stone door that could be lifted free and set aside. The combustion gases from a fire in this box did not go up and out through a chimney in the conventional sense. Instead, Margaret had laid a low flue channel 4 inches tall and 6 inches wide, constructed from flat stones in a covered trench that ran from the back of the firebox along the floor of the chamber in a long S-curve, traveling the full 12-foot length of the space before rising through the far wall and exiting through a clay-sealed pipe she had inserted through the woodshed's south wall at ground level. The S-curve was the heart of the system. It forced hot combustion gases to travel 26 linear feet of contact with the surrounding granite mass before escaping. By the time those gases reached the exit pipe, they were barely warm. The heat had been surrendered entirely to the stone. And then once the stone held that heat, it had somewhere to go. Running from the southeast corner of the chamber at floor level was a clay-lined crawl tunnel 30 inches in diameter and 11 feet long that terminated beneath the stone foundation of Margaret's house, opening directly into the crawl space under the kitchen floor. She had fitted both ends with stone plugs that could be removed or inserted by hand. When the plugs were out and the chamber had been fired, warm air from the granite mass migrated naturally through the tunnel and rose up through the gaps in the kitchen floorboards. Not in a rush, not like a stove, more like breath, slow and steady, the way warm air rises from pavement on a summer afternoon and keeps rising long after the sun has set. She finished the chamber in late September of 1886. She fired it for the first time on the 12th of October using a controlled burn of dry split oak, 6 splits each about 22 inches long, placed in the firebox and fed slowly over 4 hours. She monitored the exit pipe at the south wall by pressing the back of her hand 1 inch from the opening. In the first hour, the air coming out was warm. That was wrong. Warm exit air meant the stone was not absorbing what it should be. She adjusted the airflow and waited. By the third hour, the air at the flue exit was cool enough that she could hold her hand against the opening without any discomfort. The stone was doing its work. She sealed the firebox with its stone door packed clay around the seam and went inside to wait. 12 hours later, she descended into the chamber through the hatch she had cut in the woodshed floor. She had a candle. The temperature inside at chest height in the center of the space was 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the October night had dropped to 29. She stood in that chamber for a long time. She pressed both palms flat against the granite wall and held them there, and she felt the slow, steady exhale of heat from the stone, the same heat she had first felt at 9 years old in a Pennsylvania basement with her father standing behind her. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. What she did was sit down on the stone floor in the dark with her back against the warm wall and stay there still for about 5 minutes. It was the first time in a very long time that she had nothing left to do. Then she got up, climbed back into the woodshed, and went inside to write a letter to Daniel. It was the longest letter she had sent him in 4 years. She described the chamber, the dimensions, the way the S-curve worked, what it had taken to find the right granite. She explained why her father's system had worked in Pennsylvania and why this one would work in Dakota. She wrote it plainly without drama the way her father would have written it. At the end, she wrote, "The daughter of Garrett Whitmore does not sit and wait for winter. You will understand when you come home." Not if you come home, when. Daniel did not reply for 7 weeks. 2 weeks after the chamber was complete, Frank Alderman came by the property to return a fro he had borrowed in September. Margaret walked him out to the woodshed and opened the hatch in the floor and showed him what was underneath. He stood at the edge and looked down. He could see the stone walls, the sealed firebox, the S-curve of the flue running along the base of the chamber. He stared at it for a while without speaking. Then he asked how much it had cost. Margaret told him $6 for the pine props, about $4 in other materials and tools, and roughly 40 days of her own labor. He was quiet for a moment. "And what does it do for you exactly?" "Last November, I used 8.5 quart of wood. This November, I expect to use 4, maybe 4.5. The floor above the crawl tunnel will stay warm even without a fire burning. The water pipes will not freeze." Frank looked at the numbers from a different angle. "That is a lot of wood saved." "It is." He was quiet again. Then, "Why didn't you tell anyone you were building this?" Margaret looked at him steadily. "The last time I asked my neighbors for help was the winter of 1877. I needed people to help me cut firewood. 3 men said they would come. None of them did. I burned my back room floor to survive that week." Frank did not have anything to say to that. He took the fro and walked back to his wagon. That evening, he told Vera about the chamber. Vera listened without expression. When he finished, she said, "I know." He looked at her. "Since when?" "Since July. She asked me not to say anything." Frank sat with that for a moment. "And you didn't tell me?" "She asked me not to." It was the first time in their marriage that Vera had kept something like this from him, and it was not because she was hiding it. It was because she had made a promise and she had kept it. Frank understood that. But sitting in the kitchen that night, he also understood something else. There were things happening around him that he had not been paying close enough attention to. He went to the window and looked out toward the north. Margaret's property was invisible in the dark. He stood there for a while thinking about $4 in 40 days of labor and a woman who had burned her own floor rather than ask again for help that would not come. Then he went to bed. Outside, the thermometer on the porch post read 7 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was only the 8th of November. The winter had barely started. December came in quietly, which was the thing about Dakota winters that people kept forgetting. They came in quiet and they stayed quiet long enough for you to believe they had decided to be reasonable, and then they stopped being reasonable all at once. By the middle of December, Frank Alderman had burned through 6 cord of his winter supply. He had stacked 14 cord total along the south wall of his house in October, which had seemed like more than enough. It no longer seemed like more than enough. He was doing the arithmetic in his head every morning now, the way a man counts what is left in his wallet when he is far from home. He had not asked Margaret to teach him. Not yet. He was still working up to it in the way that men work up to admitting they need something they should have asked for months ago. Margaret, by the middle of December, had burned 2 cord and 3/4. She did not advertise this. But Frank came by on the 15th to return a splitting maul he had borrowed in November, and while Margaret went to get it from the woodshed, he stood in her kitchen and noticed the notebook open on the shelf above the window. He was not a man who read other people's private ledgers, but the notebook was open, and the numbers were written large and clear, and the column for firewood consumption was right there. He read it before he fully decided to. He was still looking at it when Margaret came back in. She said nothing. She handed him the maul. He said 4 cord and a half since October. 4 cord and 3/4. I fired the chamber twice last month. He set the maul down against the wall. He was a large man and the kitchen was not large, and when he sat down without being invited, his presence changed the room. Margaret, I want to learn to build it. Spring, she said, when the ground is workable. And if this winter is worse than last, she looked at him directly, then you come here. He nodded once, picked up the maul, and left. That evening, he told Vera what he had seen in the notebook. Vera listened. When he finished, she said, I told you she knew what she was doing. Frank didn't argue. He sat by the stove and did the arithmetic again in his head, and the numbers were not comfortable. What Frank did not know, because Margaret had not told him, was that she was doing arithmetic of her own kind that December. Not about wood, about Daniel. The letter arrived the week before Christmas, tucked in with a small parcel of thread and 2 printed pamphlets that Daniel had apparently thought she might find useful. The letter itself was 4 paragraphs. The first 3 were about Minneapolis, the trading office, the weather there, which Daniel described as cold but manageable. The 4th paragraph was the one that mattered. He wrote that he had spoken to a woman in his neighborhood, a Mrs. Halverson, who had a cousin somewhere near Huron, and that this cousin had apparently mentioned Margaret's name in connection with something unusual she was doing to her property. Daniel wrote that Mrs. Halverson had described it secondhand as digging a large pit under the woodshed for unclear reasons. He wrote that he wanted to ask directly, was she all right? Was there anything she needed? He wrote it kindly. That was what made it difficult. He was not being dismissive. He was genuinely worried, but he was worried about the wrong thing entirely. He was worried about his mother's mind, and his mother's mind was the sharpest thing on 60 miles of river bottom. Margaret read the letter twice at the kitchen table. The floor under her feet was warm. The stove had been cold for 2 hours. She sat for a while. Then she got up and went out to the woodshed and opened the hatch and climbed down into the chamber. It was dark down there. She had not brought a candle. She stood in the black and pressed her palm against the granite wall and felt a slow pulse of heat still moving outward through the stone. The chamber temperature was 47 degrees by her estimate. It had been 51 in October. 12 weeks of December cold had pulled it down 4 degrees. She stood in the dark, and she let herself feel the doubt that she had been keeping at an arm's length for weeks. Not about the engineering. She was not uncertain about the engineering. She was uncertain about whether any of it mattered if the one person she had built it partly for thought she had lost her mind based on a second-hand account from a woman in Minneapolis who had a cousin near Huron. She stood there for 15 minutes. Then she pressed her palm harder against the stone, and she thought about her father standing in his Pennsylvania basement in 1849, telling a 9-year-old girl that doubt is a thing that happens in the air, and stone does not live in the air. She climbed back up. She wrote Daniel a letter that night. She told him about the chamber in careful detail, the same technical clarity she would have used if she were writing to another stonemason. She told him what her father had taught her and why it worked. And at the end she wrote, I am not confused, Daniel. I am prepared. Those 2 things have been getting mixed up around here for some time. Come in spring and I will show you the difference. She did not write, I need you to believe me. She did not need him to believe her. The stone in the wall was 47 degrees in the middle of a Dakota December, and it had not been fired in 6 weeks, and it would hold for another month at least. The stone did not need Daniel to believe in it either. What she could not have known, sitting in her kitchen writing that letter, was that Daniel read it in Minneapolis 2 weeks later and read it a second time, and then went and found a man he knew who had studied building construction, a man named Peterson, who had worked on foundations in St. Paul, and asked him quietly whether any of what his mother had described was technically sound. Peterson read the letter over Daniel's shoulder and said without hesitation, every bit of it. I've never seen anyone do it out here, but the principle is solid. Your mother knows what she's talking about. Daniel folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and carried it there for 3 days before he wrote back. His reply was one of the longest letters he had sent in years. He promised to come in spring. Not might, would. Margaret received that letter in the second week of January. She read it at the kitchen table in the morning. Outside the window, the sky was the color of pewter, and the temperature at dawn had been -14 and had not moved since. She read Daniel's promise, once folded the letter, and placed it in the tin box. Then she put on her coat and went out to check the hatch. She did not know yet that she had 4 days before everything in the settlement changed. The storm announced itself on the night of January 9th, not with wind, but with silence. The temperature, which had been sitting at around -10, dropped another 6 degrees in an hour. The sky cleared completely, which sounds like a good thing, and in a Dakota January is not. Clear sky in deep winter means nothing between you and the cold above, no insulation of cloud, just open dark and temperature falling through it without friction. Margaret lay in bed that night and listened to the silence and knew. She was up before 5 in the morning. She did not light the kitchen stove. She went to the barometer, first tapped the glass and watched the needle. It had dropped significantly overnight, farther and faster than anything she had seen since 1877. She went out to the barn in the gray pre-dawn and stood next to Gull. The horse was pressed against the south wall, both ears flattened, and he had not touched his oats. Margaret stood with him for a moment, her hand on his neck. He did not turn to look at her. He was looking at the wall, or at something beyond it. She went back to the house. She did not fire the kitchen stove. She went directly to the woodshed and began firing the chamber. She used 9 splits of dry oak over 8 hours, feeding them slowly, watching the exit pipe at intervals of 30 minutes. It was the longest controlled burn she had done. By early afternoon, the granite walls of the chamber had absorbed more heat than she had ever charged them with in a single firing. When she sealed the firebox and packed the clay around the door, the stones inside that chamber held enough warmth to bleed upward for 4 days without any additional fuel. That afternoon, she walked the quarter-mile to Frank Alderman's property and knocked on the door. Vera opened it. Margaret said, "Where's Frank?" "In the barn." Margaret went to the barn. Frank was mending a piece of harness. She said, "Fire your chamber tonight, all the way through." He looked up. The sky was clear this morning. "Fire it anyway." He looked at her for a moment, not skeptically. He had stopped being skeptical sometime in December when he had seen the numbers in the notebook. He nodded and set down the harness. She sent word through Walter Pruitt to the 3 other households with functioning chambers. Walter, to his credit, did not ask why. He had learned over the past months of working alongside Margaret and watching the numbers and feeling with his own hands what the stone could do, that when she said something needed doing, it needed doing. He saddled his horse and rode to the 2 remaining properties before dark. By the time the storm arrived, all 5 chambers were fired and sealed. The blizzard of January 1887 came in on the morning of January 12th. The temperature dropped from -10 to -19 at dawn and kept falling. The wind came from the northwest at 32 miles an hour, with gusts to 44, and within 3 hours, the drifts against the south walls of every house in the settlement had reached the windowsills. Walter Pruitt's trouble started on the 3rd day. He had known since September that the northeast section of his barn roof had a weakness. One of the main support beams had developed a crack over the summer, and he had looked at it and made the decision that it could wait until spring, that it would hold through one more winter, that he would get to it. He had not told Agnes. There was no specific reason he had not told her. He had simply handled it the way he handled most structural concerns, which was to look at them, decide they were manageable, and move on. The roof did not collapse. But on the 3rd day of the storm, with 4 feet of wet snow accumulating on the northeast section, the weakened beam shifted 2 inches, and the section above it sagged badly enough that the space below became inaccessible. The bulk of their winter food supply, the sacks of flour, the salted meat, the dried goods in barrels, was stored in that section. It was 6 feet from where Walter stood, and it might as well have been in Minnesota. He worked for 4 hours trying to shore up the beam from underneath, while the wind drove snow through every gap in the barn wall. By the time he came inside, his hands were white at the tips, and his face was stripped raw, and the beam had not moved. Agnes was at the kitchen table when he came in. She looked at him, and she knew immediately that something had gone wrong beyond the storm itself. She had been married to Walter Pruitt for 7 years, and she could read the difference between a man beaten by weather and a man beaten by something he had done to himself. She waited. He told her about the beam. He told her about the food supply. He told her he had known about the cracks since September. Agnes did not raise her voice. She was 8 months pregnant, and she was sitting at the kitchen table of a house that was rapidly cooling, and she did not have the energy or the interest in anger right now. She looked at him steadily and asked, "How much food do we have in the house?" He told her, 3 days, maybe 4 if they were careful. She looked out the window at the white that had replaced the world. Then she looked back at Walter and asked the question that mattered. "Do you know the way to Margaret Nissen's place from here if you can't see the road?" He did. He had ridden it enough times in good weather to know where the fence lines ran. "Then we go tomorrow morning," Agnes said, "first light." Walter looked at her, at the weight she was carrying, at the week she had left. "Agnes, the storm isn't breaking." "I know. We go anyway." She stood up from the table with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has recalculated her options and found only one. "And Walter, when we get there, you will thank her properly." He nodded. He went back out to check the horses. He stood in the barn for a while in the dark and thought about September, about the beam, about all the things he had decided were manageable and had turned out not to be. Frank Alderman ran out of indoor wood on the morning of the 7th day. He had stored his main winter supply against the exterior south wall of the house, which was the traditional method in the sensible 1 in 9 winters out of 10. The 10th winter buried it under 6 feet of compacted drift in 36 hours. He had brought enough inside at the start of the storm to last 3 days, planning to refill from the exterior stack as needed. He had not been able to reach the exterior stack since the morning of the 2nd day. On the morning of the 7th day, he used the last of the interior kindling to start a small fire enough to heat coffee and nothing else. Vera sat at the table with Lily, their youngest 4 years old, wrapped in 2 coats and a blanket. The kitchen temperature was 41 degrees. It would go lower. Frank looked around the kitchen. His eyes went to the chair in the corner. A heavy oak chair with turned legs that Vera's mother had sent from Ohio when they married, shipped on a wagon all the way from Columbus. Vera's mother had died 2 years later, and the chair was the last thing Vera had of her. He looked at Vera. She was already looking at the chair. "Do it," she said. He crossed the room and lifted the chair and carried it to the center of the floor and turned it upside down. He worked the joints loose with his hands and then used the heel of his boot on the seat until it separated. Lily watched from the table without saying anything. Children raised on the prairie understood certain things early. The fire from the chair wood lasted a little over an hour. When it was down to coals, Frank put on every piece of clothing he owned, layering them over each other, and he looked at Vera and said, "I am going to Margaret Nissen's place." Vera stood up. She did not argue. She unwrapped the blanket from around Lily and wrapped it instead around Lily and Frank together, binding the child to his chest with a length of rope tied across his back so his arms would be free. Lily pressed her face against his collarbone and did not complain. She was 4 years old, and she trusted her father completely, which was a trust he intended to deserve. Vera kissed him once and said, "Follow the north fence line. Don't leave it." He nodded. "Frank," he stopped. "I told her in July that I believed her. I want you to tell her I still do." He went out into the storm. Margaret heard the knock at 2 in the afternoon, and her first thought was that she had imagined it because nobody was out in this. She went to the door and opened it. Frank stood in the snow. Lily was bound to his chest, her face buried in his coat, still breathing. His own face had gone a deep, raw red that was almost purple at the cheekbones. Snow had packed into the creases of his coat and the gaps at his wrists, and he was shaking at the shoulders in long, involuntary waves. Margaret stepped aside. He came in. He crossed the kitchen and stood directly over the warmest section of floor above where the crawl tunnel ran beneath, and he held Lily against his chest and stood there with his eyes closed and let the heat from the boards work its way through his boots. Margaret had the stove going and a pot on before he had stopped shaking. She did not ask him to explain anything. She poured water and put bread on the table, and let him be a man standing on a warm floor for a few minutes before anything else was required. An hour later, there was another knock, Agnes and Walter Pruitt. Agnes's hand in Walter's moving through the door the way two people move when one of them is keeping the other upright. Walter's face had the look of a man who has been outside too long, not panicked, but deeply carefully focused, the way concentration looks when it is the only thing holding a situation together. Agnes came through the door and sat down immediately in the nearest chair. She was breathing carefully, deliberately. Walter crossed the kitchen and knelt down. He pressed both hands flat against the floor. He stayed there for a moment, long enough for Margaret pouring water at the counter to notice. She did not say anything. She brought Agnes a cup and set it on the table. Walter stood up. He looked at Margaret and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that was not an apology exactly, because an apology was too small for the distance between September and now. It was more like an acknowledgement, the way two people acknowledge something heavy by simply not looking away from it. Reverend Edmund Hollis arrived at dusk alone, having walked a mile and a half in the storm. He had started 3 days earlier, praying that things would improve, and had come gradually to the understanding that they would not, and that sitting in a house where the water barrel was growing a skin of ice and calling it faith was not actually faith. It was stubbornness wearing faith clothes. He came through the door and stood dripping in the kitchen entry. Margaret looked at him. He was 52 years old, and he was not a man who changed his mind easily, and she could see from his face that something in him had shifted on the walk over. He said, "You told me last summer. I should have listened." "You're here now," Margaret said. "Come in and sit down." He did. 4 more people arrived before dark, a family of 3 who had been traveling by wagon when the storm hit and had followed the fence lines east until the lights of Margaret's house appeared through the snow, and a man alone who would not give his name at first and simply sat on the floor and put his head in his hands. By nightfall, there were 11 people in Margaret Nissen's kitchen. The floor was warm under all of them. Margaret moved through the space with the efficiency of someone who had thought about this without knowing she was thinking about it. She had food enough in the root cellar for 3 weeks if she portioned it carefully. She had the crawl tunnel at partial open enough to maintain the floor temperature without depleting the thermal charge too quickly. She watched the gauge of it constantly, not with anxiety, but with the focused attention of a craftsman monitoring a process. On the 3rd night, Walter Pruitt sat against the kitchen wall with his sleeping son on his lap and watched Margaret cross the room for the 4th time in an hour to check the same spot near the east wall. He said quietly, so as not to wake anyone, "Do you ever stop?" "When there is nothing left to check, I stop," she said. "Right now, there is still something to check." He watched her kneel and press her hand to the floor. She nodded to herself and stood back up. "Why didn't you just tell people in the beginning," he asked, "about the chamber, about what it did?" Margaret looked at him for a moment. "I did tell people. I told you, Mr. Pruitt, in the summer. You were on the road to the south, and you slowed down and looked at the mound behind my barn, and you kept going." He did not flinch from that. He let it sit. "I did. You were not ready to hear it then. You are ready now." She turned toward the stove. Most knowledge is like that. On the 5th day of their stay, Agnes Pruitt went into labor. It was 3 in the morning, and the storm was still running, and the temperature outside was -22. Margaret woke first to the sound of Agnes's breathing changing. Vera Alderman was up within minutes. Reverend Hollis, who had some rudimentary knowledge from years of attending to his congregation in medical emergencies, positioned himself where he was useful and stayed out of the way of the women, which was the most useful thing he could have done. The baby was born on the kitchen floor of Margaret Nissen's house at 4:47 in the morning. A boy. He came into the world on warm boards in a warm room while a blizzard pressed against the windows, and he announced himself with the kind of cry that fills a room completely. Walter Pruitt, who had been sitting in the doorway to the next room because Vera had firmly placed him there and told him to stay, came into the kitchen at the sound of that cry. He crossed the room and knelt down and took his son from Margaret's hands. He held the child against his chest, and he did not speak for a while. Agnes lay on the folded blankets on the floor and looked up at the ceiling of Margaret Nissen's kitchen. After a moment, she turned her head and found Margaret standing near the counter. We want to give him a middle name, Agnes said. Her voice was exhausted and clear at the same time. Margaret said nothing. Margaret, Agnes said. James Margaret Pruitt. Walter looked up from the child. He looked at his wife, then at Margaret, then back at his wife. He nodded. Margaret turned away for a moment toward the window. The storm was still out there. In the glass, she could see the faint reflection of the room behind her. The 11 people, the warm floor, the lamp. She stood there long enough that Frank Alderman, watching from across the room, saw the slight movement at her shoulders that she did not let become anything more than that. Then she turned back. She poured water, she brought it to Agnes, and she kept moving. The storm broke on the morning of January 20th. The wind stopped first, then the sky lightened towards something that was not quite blue, but was at least not white. The temperature was still -18, but the stillness after 8 days of wind felt almost warm by comparison, the way silence feels like a sound after noise. 11 people walked out of Margaret Nissen's house into the sharp morning air and stood in the yard and looked at what the storm had done. 3 feet of settled snow on the flat surfaces. Drifts to the eaves on the north side of every structure. Walter Pruitt's barn had taken serious damage to the northeast section, exactly where he had known it would if the beam went. The Alderman cordwood was buried completely. Reverend Hollis's church had lost half its roof. They stood in the yard and took stock. Nobody said much. The accounting was visible without words. Walter Pruitt was the last one out the door. He stopped on the step and turned back. Margaret was standing at the kitchen counter. He said, April, first week the ground softens. I'll be here. She said, I know. He nodded and went out into the snow. Across the settlement, people were digging out and counting their losses. Cattle that had frozen standing water barrels that had cracked one family that had spent 4 days in the barn because the house had become uninhabitable. The conversation when it started was careful and quiet and had a lot of silence in it, the silence of people working out what they should have done differently. Frank Alderman commissioned a chamber that spring. 3 other families followed. Walter Pruitt began his in April, as promised, working alongside Margaret through the first 2 weeks of warm weather, learning the weight of granite and the logic of the S-curve, and how to read the exit pipe with the back of his hand. He was a fast learner when he applied himself, and he applied himself without reservation. By the fall of 1887, 5 properties along the James River had functioning thermal mass chambers beneath their woodsheds or barns. The Huron Weekly Plainsman noted this in 4 sentences on page 3 of the October issue. The article did not include Margaret's name. It referred to a Norwegian-born homesteader and described the method as unusual but apparently effective. Reverend Hollis found the article and brought it to Margaret. She read it. She put it down. She asked if the technical description was accurate. Hollis said it was mostly right. Then that's enough, she said. She meant it. What she needed was not in the newspaper. What she needed was in the 5 chambers sitting under 5 woodsheds within 4 miles of her kitchen, charged with heat and ready. She had a sense, the same sense she'd had watching the barometer on the morning of January 9th the year before, that it was not time to relax. She wrote to Daniel in August. It was the longest letter she had written him in years, longer even than the technical letter about the chamber. She told him about the storm. She told him about the 11 people in the kitchen. She told him about Agnes and Walter and the baby born on the warm floor. And then she told him something she had never told anyone. She told him about the winter of 1877. The full version, not the one she had told him before. The night Thomas was away and the fire went out and she burned the back room floor and sat alone in the kitchen in the dark and felt what it felt like to have no options left. She told him she had made a decision that night, sitting by the dead stove with the smell of scorched pine in the air, that she would spend whatever energy she had left building something that worked better than luck. She wrote, I did not build the chamber to be remembered for it. I built it because I had been helpless once in a way that I was not going to be again, and because I wanted to have something to show you when you came home. I do not say this to make you feel responsible for it. You are not responsible for it. I say it because you asked me once in a letter if I was all right, and I want you to know the full answer, which is that I have been all right for some time now, but not by accident. She ended the letter, "Come in spring. I am not asking this time. I am telling you." Daniel wrote back in 3 days, which was the fastest he had ever responded to anything. He promised the same as before. But this time he also wrote, "I have been trying to understand for a long time what you were doing out there alone all these years. I think I am beginning to understand it now." Margaret read that letter sitting on the kitchen floor, her back against the wall, her feet on the warm boards. The chamber had been fired 2 weeks ago. The floor would hold its warmth for another week at least. She thought about the winter coming. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the barometer. There was something in the air that September, a quality of the light in the mornings, and the way the wind came around from the northwest at angles she did not like. She could not have explained it to anyone in words that would have convinced them. But the stone in the chamber had not forgotten the heat from August firing, and Margaret Nissen had not forgotten anything either, and both of them were ready. The winter of 1888 was 12 weeks away. Daniel Nissen kept his promise. He arrived on the 3rd of April, 1888, on a morning when the James River was running brown with snow melt and the fields around Margaret's property had just started showing the first pale green of new grass pushing through the soil. He came by wagon from the Huron Depot, having taken the train from Minneapolis the day before, and he drove the last 12 miles alone through country he had not seen in many years. He had his father's build, wide through the shoulders, and he had grown a beard in the past year that Margaret had not known about from the letters. He pulled the wagon into the yard and sat on the seat for a moment before climbing down the way a person sits when they have arrived somewhere they have been approaching for longer than the actual distance. Margaret was not in the house. He knocked twice and got no answer, and then he heard the sound of a spade in the earth around the side of the barn, and he followed it. She was working along the base of the barn's south foundation, extending a drainage channel she had been planning since the previous fall. She was wearing her work coat and her oldest boots, and she looked like someone who had been doing this kind of work for 40 years and expected to be doing it for 40 more. She did not hear him approach over the sound of the spade and the running water in the ditch. He stopped and watched her for a moment. He was not sure what he had expected, but it was not the plain efficiency of it, the way she moved without wasted motion, the way she checked the channel's angle with her eye, the same way a carpenter checks a line. He said, "Ma." She stopped. She did not startle. She straightened up and turned around, and she looked at him the way you look at something you have been waiting for long enough that seeing it feels almost strange, as if the waiting itself had become more real than the thing you were waiting for. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "You're thinner than I thought you'd be." He laughed just once, and the tension in his shoulders went out of him. "You look exactly the same." "I don't," she said. She picked up her spade and walked toward him. She stopped when she was close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. She was a small woman, and he was not a small man, and she looked at him the way she looked at a foundation she was assessing carefully from multiple angles, as if she were checking what was structural and what was not. She put her free hand briefly on his arm. That was all. Then she said, "Have you eaten?" He had not. They went inside. Over the meal, she watched him look at the house the way people look at places they knew as children. The table was the same. The shelf above the window was the same with the notebooks still on it, thicker now, with 7 years of entries. The tin box was not visible, but he would know it was under the bed. He looked at the floor, and she saw him look at it, and she saw the moment he realized it was warmer than it should have been for a kitchen with no fire going in April. He pressed his boot against the board and held it there. "The chamber," he asked. "I fired it 2 weeks ago. Last time of the season." He nodded slowly. He pressed his boot against the floor again, as if the warmth needed confirming a second time. After they had eaten, Margaret took the key to the woodshed hatch off the peg by the door and set it on the table in front of him without comment. He picked it up, and they went out together. She opened the hatch and descended first, and he followed her down into the chamber. It was April, and the chamber was cool now, having given most of its charge to the house over the past 2 weeks. But it was not cold. It held, as it always held, at this depth, the stable temperature of the earth itself. Daniel stood in the low space and looked at the walls and the floor and the sealed firebox and the S-curve of the flue channel running along the base of the far wall. He walked slowly to the north end and put his hand on the firebox stone. He said, "Peterson told me every bit of it was sound. The man I asked in Minneapolis." "I know. You knew I asked someone. I assumed you would have. You were always careful that way." She paused. "Your grandfather was the same." He stood looking at the walls for a while. The stone was quiet in the way that stone is always quiet, indifferent to being looked at, indifferent to being admired. It had done what it had been built to do, and it was waiting to do it again. "The letters," Daniel said. He was still looking at the wall. "I read them again on the train. All of yours from the past 5 years." Margaret said nothing. "I didn't read them carefully enough the first time. Any of them." He turned to look at her. "I thought you were managing. I didn't understand that managing and what you were actually doing were two completely different things." "They usually are," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Ma, I'm sorry I didn't come sooner." She looked at him for a long time. The chamber was still and cool around them, the granite walls holding their patience the way they held everything else. She said, "You're here now." And there was nothing in those 3 words except what they meant, which was enough. They spent 5 days on the property together. Daniel went through the farm with the thoroughness of a man who has been carrying guilt about not coming back and is now converting it into usefulness. He repaired 2 sections of fencing that Margaret had been planning to get to since autumn. He replaced a rotted sillboard on the barn's east wall. He spent an afternoon with Gull, who was moving slowly now, but who pressed his head against Daniel's shoulder with the recognition of an animal that remembers things across very long distances. On the third evening, Daniel found the notebook on the shelf and asked if he could read it. Margaret said yes. He sat at the kitchen table and went through it from the first entry in 1880 to the most recent one from February. 11 years of winter records in her careful hand, date, outside temperature, floor, temperature, cord of wood consumed. The pattern was clear even without explanation. The years before the chamber were one thing. The years after were another. He closed the notebook and sat with his hands on it. Margaret was at the counter, not looking at him. He said 4 cord against 9 every year. Not every year, some years less. Every year, he said, again, not arguing, stating. On the 4th day, he found the 3 pages. Margaret had not told him about them. She had left them where she always kept them, folded inside the back cover of the notebook. And when Daniel lifted the notebook to set it back on the shelf, and the pages slid out and fell to the table, she watched him pick them up with the careful hands of someone handling something that belongs to someone else. He read them standing at the table. 3 pages in his mother's handwriting, the same handwriting as the letters, but more deliberate, each word placed with the precision of someone who knows they are writing a thing meant to last. The dimensions of the chamber, the selection criteria for granite, the procedure for firing, the geometry of the flue, the crawl tunnel specifications. Practical, exact, without ornament. He read to the last sentence. He read it again. "Stone does not forget warmth as easily as people forget what they owe each other." He set the pages down. He did not look up for a while. When he did, his voice was level, but something behind it was not entirely level. "You wrote this to give to me." "Yes." "When?" "2 winters ago, after the 1887 storm. Before I knew whether you would actually come." He looked at the pages again. "Why didn't you send them with a letter?" Margaret considered this. "Because some things need to be handed to a person, not mailed." Daniel picked the pages up again and held them. He was a man who worked in a trading office, who dealt in numbers and contracts and the written confirmation of things, and he understood, perhaps better than most, the difference between a document and a document that someone has decided to keep for you until you were ready to receive it. He put them carefully in his coat's inner pocket. That night, he sat on the kitchen floor, his back against the wall below the window, reading the letters from the tin box. Not all of them. The ones from the years right after he had left for Minnesota. He had been a boy when she wrote them, and he read them now as a grown man and found that they were not what he remembered them being. He had remembered them as practical and newsy and not very emotional, the letters of a busy woman reporting on weather and crops and the doings of neighbors. Reading them now, he understood that the practicality was the emotion. Every careful detail she had written, every account of what the garden produced and what the horses needed and what the temperature had reached that week was a way of saying, this is the place you came from. This is still here. You are still connected to it. He sat on the floor for 2 hours. At one point, he pressed his palm flat against the floorboard. The boards were cool now. It was April, the chamber was spent, and the floor was just a floor. He kept his hand there anyway. He left on the morning of the 5th day. At the wagon, he turned back and looked at Margaret, standing at the door of the house in the early light. "I'm coming back," he said, "not to visit, to stay." She nodded once. She had not expected him to say it, and she had also somewhere beneath expectation not been surprised. He drove out of the yard. She watched until the wagon turned onto the road and was gone. Then she went inside and poured coffee and stood at the window and looked at the field where the grass was green, now properly green, the tentative color of a Dakota spring that might still betray you but probably wouldn't. She thought about the winter coming 9 months away. She thought about Daniel driving back. She thought about the chamber under the woodshed, empty now, waiting. She picked up her spade and went back to the drainage channel. On the 12th of January, 1888, the world tried to finish what the previous year had started. The morning was wrong from the first light, not in the way the 1887 storm had announced itself with silence and falling temperature. This one came disguised. The temperature at dawn was 35 degrees, which was warm for January in Dakota, warm enough that a person might open the door and feel something almost like relief, as if winter had decided to give back what it had taken. The sky was clear. The air was still. Margaret stood on the porch at 6 in the morning and breathed it in and felt the wrongness of it in a way she could not have reduced to numbers. It was the quality of the light too flat for a warm morning. It was the pressure in the air, which her body read the way old injuries read weather. It was the barometer which had dropped overnight at a rate she had never seen in 14 years on this land. She went to the barn. Gull was standing in the center of the stall. Not at the wall, not near his feed, just standing in the middle of the space with his head slightly lowered and his ears turned in a direction that corresponded to nothing visible. Margaret stood with him for a moment. She put her hand on his neck. He did not respond. She went back to the house and began firing the chamber. This firing was different from any she had done before. She had never fired it the way she fired it that morning, not because the technique was different, but because the intention was. Every other firing had been preparatory. This one felt final, like closing a door against something that was already on the other side. She worked through the morning, feeding the firebox in the careful rhythm she had developed over 6 years, checking the exit pipe at intervals, monitoring the draw. By mid-morning, she could feel the chamber reaching capacity, the granite walls holding more heat than they had ever held at once. She sealed the firebox at noon and packed the clay around the door with her hands. Then she put on her coat and walked to Frank Alderman's property. He was in the yard when she arrived splitting wood, and he looked up when he saw her coming, and he set the axe down before she reached the gate. He had learned over the past year and a half to read her arrivals. She said, "Fire yours today, right now." He looked at the clear sky. 35 degrees, sunshine. "Margaret, I know what it looks like," she said. "Fire it." He studied her face for a moment. It was the face of a woman who had been right about this before when the evidence suggested otherwise. He picked up his coat from the fence post and put it on. Walter Pruitt got the message through a boy Frank sent on horseback, and Walter relayed it to the remaining 2 households himself, riding through the unseasonable warmth with the urgency of a man who understood what was at stake, because he had spent a week in Margaret's kitchen, and he had held his son on a warm floor, and he was not going to be the person who ignored this. All 5 chambers were burning by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 40 minutes. At 3:30, the wind came. It came from the northwest at speeds that bent the fence posts and drove snow so hard and so horizontal that within 20 minutes there was no difference between the ground and the air. A person standing 10 feet from their own front door could not see the door. People who were inside stayed inside. People who were outside in the wrong place at the wrong moment were in serious trouble, and some of them did not get out of it. Across Dakota Territory and into Nebraska and Minnesota, the school children's blizzard of January 12, 1888 killed people with a speed and comprehensiveness that made the previous year's storm seem like a warning that hadn't been taken seriously enough. Children died on the roads from school in groups and alone a quarter mile from home, 100 yards from home, some within sight of lit windows. Adults died between buildings. The temperature, which had been 35 degrees at noon, reached -30 with the wind by nightfall. The instruments at Huron stopped working. Livestock losses across the territory were catastrophic beyond any prior measure. Along the James River, in a strip of 5 farms within 4 miles of each other, none of that happened. The floors held. The pipes held. The water barrels stayed liquid. The livestock sheltered in barns that held more warmth than they should have been able to hold because the woman who had designed the system had understood something about barn foundations that she had simply extended from the principle she had already proven in the woodshed. 3 of the 5 households took in people from the road travelers who had been moving when the storm hit a family whose house had failed a man who had been walking between properties on an errand that had suddenly become a matter of survival. They came to the doors that were warm, and they were let in without question, without accounting. George Whitfield arrived at Margaret's door on the first evening of the storm. He was a Huron merchant, 40 years old, a man of commerce and hotel lobbies, who had been caught traveling between properties on business and had followed a fence line east until he found a light. He came in out of the blizzard and stood in the kitchen entry and looked around and recognized the room. He had been here before, in the 1887 storm. He had sat at this table and questioned whether Margaret had a plan, and she had answered him with the kind of patience that is indistinguishable from certainty, and he had not known then what to do with that. He knew now. He sat down at the table. He put his hands flat on the surface. He did not say anything immediately. When he finally spoke, he looked at Margaret directly. "I went back to Huron after the last storm and I told people what I had seen here. I told the editor of the paper. I thought that was useful." He paused. "I don't think anyone understood what I was describing." Margaret poured water and set it before him. "Did you understand it yourself?" He considered that. "I understood that it worked. I didn't understand why." He looked around the kitchen. "I still don't, not technically. But I understand that you knew it would work in July of 1886, and I understand that most of us were still uncertain about it in January of 1887, and I understand that the difference between those two things is not small." Margaret sat down across from him. "The difference," she said, "is 9 years of thinking about a problem that most people had decided wasn't worth thinking about." Whitfield nodded slowly. "I want to write something about this, after the storm, for the paper, but properly this time, with your name on it, with the actual explanation." Margaret looked at him. She was not a woman who sought recognition, and he could see that, but she was also a woman who understood what documentation was for. The 3 pages she had written for Daniel were not vanity, they were transmission. Knowledge passed from one set of hands to the next. "The technical description needs to be accurate," she said. "You would write it yourself. I would see that it was printed." She considered this for a moment. Then she nodded once with the finality of someone who has decided on a course of action and will not revisit the decision. The storm ran for 2 days. When it broke, the silence was total, the kind of silence that exists only when something very loud has stopped. Margaret stood in the doorway of her house at first light on the morning of the 14th and looked at the world, which was white and still and enormous. The people in her kitchen began the process of returning to their own properties. They went in stages, some with help from others, checking on neighbors along the way. Walter Pruitt went to assess his barn first and found it intact. Frank Alderman found his cordwood buried again and laughed briefly at the specific cruelty of that repetition. Whitfield shook Margaret's hand at the door before he left, a formal gesture from a man who did not quite know the right way to thank someone for something this size. The accounting of the larger disaster came in over the following days through neighbors and newspaper writers, and word carried from property to property. The names of the dead accumulated in the papers through the rest of January and into February. Whole communities on the open plains had been devastated. The storm had been so fast and so severe that preparation of any ordinary kind had been no preparation at all. In the settlement near the James River, not one person had died. In February, the community gathered at Frank Alderman's house and drafted a letter to the county land office in Huron recommending that the thermal mass chamber system be officially documented and made available to any homesteader who requested it. 11 men signed the letter. Walter Pruitt wrote the first signature. Reverend Hollis wrote the last. Whitfield was not present, but had sent a written endorsement that Frank read aloud. The letter arrived in Huron in late February, somewhat crumpled from its transit. Whether any official action resulted from it was never confirmed. No formal record has been found. What was confirmed was the article in the Huron Weekly Plainsman in March of 1888. 2 columns on page 2 with Margaret Nissen's name in it and a description of the thermal mass chamber that was technically accurate in every particular because Margaret had written the technical section herself and given it to Whitfield with a note that said he was not to change the measurements. The article described the principle, the construction sequence, the firing procedure, and the results across 2 severe winters. It ended with a quote attributed to Margaret Nissen directly, "The cold is not the problem. Not knowing how to answer it is the problem. These are different things." She kept a copy of the article in the tin box under the letters from Daniel. Daniel moved back to the James River property in the spring of 1894, 3 years after Margaret died. He came with his wife and their 2 children, a daughter of 7 and a son of 4, and they arrived in April as he had on his first visit when the fields were just turning green. He had gone back to Minneapolis after that April visit in 1888 and kept his promise to return permanently through 3 more years of intention. Then Margaret died in January of 1891 of pneumonia at 62 years old. Daniel was with her. He had come in November when it became clear she was not well, and he stayed through the winter, and he was in the house when she died, and that was the one thing about the timing that he was grateful for. He had handled the property from a distance for 2 years, after that not ready to move to it and not willing to let it go. In 1894, he stopped hesitating. The house was intact. The barn was intact. The woodshed had shifted slightly on its foundation, but was structurally sound. The chamber beneath it was exactly as he remembered it, walls uncracked after 8 years' floor, solid firebox sealed. He descended through the hatch on the morning of his first full day back and stood in the space and pressed his palm to the granite wall. Cold now, the chamber had not been fired in 3 years. He stood there for a while, then he climbed back up and went to find his tools. He fired the chamber for the first time that October for the winter of 1894. He did it alone, as she had always done, it checking the exit pipe with the back of his hand, monitoring the draw, sealing the firebox when the stone was ready. He found that he knew more about the process than he had realized he knew. Some of it was from watching her in that one April week. Some of it was from the 3 pages he had carried in his coat pocket for 6 years and read so many times that he could close his eyes and see the handwriting. He taught the procedure to his son when the boy was old enough to follow him into the chamber, the way knowledge like this had always traveled by proximity, by demonstration, by the weight of a hand on a wall of warm stone. Nora Alderman lived to be 86 years old, and in the year before she died, she told her granddaughter about the kitchen floor that had been warm in the middle of a blizzard. She described it as she had described it to her mother the night it happened, and as she had described it to her own children, and now to this granddaughter who sat beside her and listened. She said, "That floor was warm when it had no right to be. That is what I remember. The thing that worked when nothing else should have." Samuel Hollis became a school teacher in Huron and taught for 31 years. He never wrote about the night in Margaret's kitchen, but he talked about it to every class he taught at least once, usually in January. He told his students about waking at 2 in the morning in the middle of a blizzard and pressing his hand to the floor and finding warmth where there should not have been any. He did not moralize about it. He simply described it the way you describe something you want a person to feel rather than just understand. James Margaret Pruitt became a structural engineer. He studied at a university in Illinois and worked for 40 years on building foundations and thermal systems, and he was considered in his field to be unusually good at the problem of how structures behave in extreme cold. He did not know until he was well into his 60s and his sister found a letter among their father's papers that he had been born on a warm kitchen floor in the middle of a blizzard, or that he had been given his middle name by a woman who had designed the floor beneath him. When he read the letter, he sat with it for a long time. Then he went to his bookshelf and took down the text on thermal mass construction that he had assigned to his graduate students for 20 years, and he found the passage he always had them read first about the Roman Hippocrates principle and how it had been applied and lost and rediscovered in various forms across many centuries, and he read it again with different eyes. Reverend Edmund Hollis served his congregation until 1909. He never again told anyone that God would take care of things without their participation. He did not make a formal announcement of this change. He simply stopped saying it and started saying other things instead. He said, worry is what you feel when you haven't done the work yet. He said, fear and preparation are not the same thing, and a person who confuses them will be cold in January. He never attributed these lines to anyone. They were his now, which meant they were also hers. Margaret Nissen did not leave behind a great estate or a formal legacy or any official record of what she had built. She left behind a notebook with 11 years of temperature readings. She left behind a tin box of letters. She left behind 3 pages of instructions written in her careful hand, which passed from Daniel to Daniel's son to Daniel's son's daughter, who donated them to a historical society in 1962, along with a note that said, "These were written by my great-grandmother, who was a stonemason's daughter and a farmer. She built something that kept people alive. I thought someone should know." The woodshed is gone now. The house is gone. The barn is gone. The land along the James River that was once her 160 acres is farmland, now planted in corn, and the people who work it do not know whose hands were in that soil first. But if you walk that ground today and you knew what to look for, you would find it. A slight depression behind where the woodshed stood, a rectangle 12 feet by 8, the center sunken a few inches where the roof boards finally gave in to time and the earth above settled into the space below. The collapse happened sometime in the early 20th century quietly with no one watching. The granite is still there. 4,200 pounds of flat-faced river stone patient in the dark cold, now holding nothing but the memory of what it once held. Stone does not forget warmth as easily as people forget what they owe each other. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things she chose to be right about. Not because she was exceptional in any way that made her different from the people around her. She was a farmer and a widow and a stonemason's daughter, and she had been cold once in a way she could not accept, and she had spent the years after it building an answer to that cold with her own hands from material she collected herself from a creek bed 3 miles away, without help, without recognition, without any particular expectation that the people who watched her do it would understand what they were watching until the winter came and they needed a warm floor to stand on. The winter always comes. What Margaret Nissen understood, and what the granite in the dark ground along the James River still knows, is that the time to build the floor is not when the storm is at the door. It is in the long, hot, improbable summer when the sky is clear and the neighbors are laughing, and everything in the world suggests that the cold is someone else's problem. She built it anyway. That is what the depression in the ground is the shape of. Not a hole, an answer. End of script.